Clay, in today's program, we wanted to touch on the topic of interpreting the Constitution. And I wanted to kind of lay out for you, like it or not, obviously it's a living document. And doesn't that mean, therefore, that to interpret it is essentially a political act?
Absolutely. It's a series of statements, 4,000 or so words long, written 221 years ago by people who couldn't have anticipated the world we live in, and they had a certain view of the structure of government, but they couldn't micromanage how things were going to play out. They were really giving a very broad and general set of principles articulation, and then we are left to decide what to make of it. And we can decide that we would very much like to do what they wanted us to do. That's the notion of original intent. Or we can decide from a more formalist or textualist basis that we can do whatever seems to be legitimized by the language of the document. In other words, we might do something that appears to be embedded in the Constitution that the Founding Fathers might object to. We're not bound in any moral or other way to determine what they intended. And even if we wanted to, Sam, it would be almost impossible for us to recover what their intentions were.
So when people talk about we need to do everything by original intent, it's kind of lacking in meaning.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean any disrespect, because you understand why people say that. They're saying this has to be, we have to ground our constitutional interpretation in something. Create a social compact, a kind of a system by which we're going to agree to handle our public lives. The Founding Fathers must have meant something. They didn't just say, do whatever you want at any given time. They created a plan, and we have some duty to try to stick to that. Otherwise, why have a Constitution? A Constitution is meant to pin down the nature of our public discourse and our public decision-making. And so when people say they want to get back to the Founding Fathers, it's a legitimate thing to say, and you understand their frustration. But it's also, as you say, sort of a meaningless statement. Let me give you some reasons why. First of all, it's hard to recover what they intended. Many of the phrases in the Constitution that have been most heavily adjudicated in American history were just sort of phrases that passed them by without deliberation. And so even if you go to James Madison's notes or the Federalist Papers, you can't always determine what they meant. And who are these they? There were 55 men there. They ranged from people who were essentially anti-federalists, who wanted to keep the states supreme, to people who were hyper-federalists like Alexander Hamilton, and every step in between, so that there is no voice of the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were 55 men like other men, and they had a completely diverse set of purposes, principles, prejudices, notions that they brought to the Constitutional Convention. They hammered out these compromises, but in many cases, the compromise language doesn't really reflect any single person's intent. And so you can't excavate the Founding Fathers' intent, because there wasn't just one of them like Moses. There were 55 of them, and they very seldom agreed on anything. So that's another reason why intent doesn't work. Here's a third. It's 221 years later. They could not have imagined, they might not even have regarded it as imaginable, the world that we live in. And we are stuck trying to apply 18th century political principles to 21st century situations. And it is always a political act. It's always an act of creativity. It's always a stretch.
Well, there was an interesting poll taken at the time Justice Roberts was elected or nominated to the Supreme Court in 2005 by the ABC News Washington Post. And in there, when you cover all people that they asked about constitutional preference, 46% said original intent, 50% said current meaning. So there's a lot of people that think that original intent is a specific thing that should be applied.
Well, yes, and I think that they have a legitimate argument, because you don't want the courts saying, well, it doesn't really matter what the Founding Fathers said. We have to adjust the world for our time and place, and if we don't like it, we'll simply abandon it. All constitutional theorists realize that their interpretations have to somehow be grounded in the text. You have to be able to point to something in the Constitution and say, this is why we're making this decision. Now, they don't necessarily have to follow what the Founding Fathers intended, if that even could be ascertained, but they have to say, maybe the Founding Fathers didn't really altogether know what they were intending. I'll give you a classical example that's really not from the Constitution, but from the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. What did he mean? He probably meant, if we could actually pin him down, all white males of a certain property base are equal in certain limited respects. And yet that's not what he wrote. He said all men are created equal. Well, this created the paradox of American history, because Jefferson was a slaveholder, women were disenfranchised, Indians weren't even part of this mix, poor whites were completely out of the mix. So by the time the Civil War comes along, Abraham Lincoln, in a famous moment, says, look, the Founding Fathers said all men are created equal. They either meant that or they didn't mean it. But we can't go on as a nation unless we mean it in the fullest possible sense. So we have to read back into Jefferson and the Founding Fathers the best, most idealistic, most universal sense of that great statement, or we can't go on. So in a certain sense, Lincoln was saying, like a judicial activist or a broad constructionist, even if you could determine what Jefferson actually meant, we have to read into that famous, wonderful statement the thing that allows us to constitute ourselves in a way that makes America what America is supposed to be. And so in a sense, he not only saved Jefferson from Jefferson's racism, but he also sort of blew the doors open of American rights tradition and said, it includes everybody, it includes African Americans, and we can't go on unless we accord them the same rights that Jefferson was really intending for his buddies.
From their writings, did the Founding Fathers realize what they were setting up for the future, that if this Constitution held for 100, 200 years, the problems that it would create for people trying to interpret what they had originally thought?
Well, it's a very good question, Sam. You know, George Washington, when he left the Constitutional Convention, was asked how long he thought this thing would be in play. He said, 25, 30 years. The Founding Fathers didn't have this sense that this was going to be Holy Writ, and that for the rest of time we were going to adhere to it or be stuck with it. And Jefferson specifically thought that was an erroneous notion. He believed that we should have constitutional revisions, even starting fresh every generation or so. But the person who did this was Jefferson's antagonist, John Marshall, the greatest of all the Chief Justices of the United States. And in a series of key cases between 1801 and 1834, he said, look, the Founding Fathers meant this to be an eternal document. They meant it to be open-ended so that it could mold itself to changing circumstances, that if they had written something that was so tightly wound that it could only apply to its own circumstances, then it would soon be a dead letter and we'd have to start over. Much better if we regard it as a kind of slightly malleable and flexible thing that can be made to work in situations that the Founding Fathers didn't anticipate. And so it's really John Marshall. If you want to talk about judicial activists and legislating from the bench, the worst offender in American history is the greatest Chief Justice, John Marshall. The Constitution that the Founding Fathers gave him was really a 10th Amendment Constitution that balanced federalism between the states and the nation. Marshall said, that's not what we're doing. We're going to aggrandize the nation. We're going to subordinate the states. We're going to create a national society. He said in Cohen's, in the famous 1821 case, this is a nation. It's even an empire, and the states have to be subordinate for this thing to work. So he was legislating from the bench, doing just what lots of people find so appalling. He was saying, I'm going to choose to push this document in a certain direction because I think that's what this country needs. All justices do this to a certain extent. He was one of the most significant in this regard.
In this segment, Clay suggests that we are not bound to original intent. Or are we? In this exercise, you should discuss the concept of stare decisis and how closely modern courts should abide by the decisions of previous courts. If stare decisis is honored, do modern decisions have their roots in the original text? As we continue to discuss interpreting the Constitution, let's bring up some specific areas. Cruel and unusual punishment.
Well, that's a great example of what the problem is, because the Founding Fathers, in writing the Bill of Rights, chiefly James Madison, said we will not have, quote, cruel and unusual punishments. They didn't say there will be no waterboarding. They didn't say there will be no cuttings off of ears. They didn't say there will be no putting someone in a very small cell and keeping the lights off or running rock music 24 hours a day into that cell. They didn't specify what a cruel and unusual punishment was. So we are left, this is a prime example of why interpretation is inevitable. Because somebody is in jail, and for one reason or another, he's denied food for a week. He then files a lawsuit saying, I have been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. Who gets to decide? If you go to the text, the Founding Fathers didn't specify whether fasting somebody against his will is cruel or unusual. So now we have to decide. How are you going to decide? Well, you could work from your hunch. I wouldn't like to be treated that way. Or you could go back to the notes of the Constitutional Convention and hope that Madison said something. Or you could go to 18th century British law and see if that phrase resonates in any way. Maybe there is some definition in British common law. Or you could talk about philosophies of crime and punishment and go back to the Italian master Beccaria. But at some point, a judge or a court is going to have to say, we either do or do not think this is cruel and unusual. Well, standards change. Thomas Jefferson, our greatest libertarian, believed that rapists should be castrated. Some people of his time believed that people who had committed adultery should be branded. People believed in whipping. So those weren't cruel or unusual at a certain point in human history. They all seem cruel and unusual today. Standards change, and each generation has to decide on questions like this how it wants to interpret them. And ideally, there will be a great deal of historical research done to find the context. And Madison, fortunately, kept almost verbatim notes of the Constitutional Convention, so we can often find out what kinds of debate was going on. But in the end, it really comes down to a political act by a majority of justices who are men and women like other men and women. And that's why the notion that we can get back to the Founding Fathers is a ludicrous notion. And remember, we must always remember the Founding Fathers were basically comfortable with slavery. They were certainly comfortable with apartheid or segregation. Most of them were racists who believed that black people were actually inferior to their white counterparts. All of them were sexists, with the exception perhaps of Aaron Burr, who believed that women should be subordinate and in the nursery and in the kitchen. All of them believed that Indians were foreigners, that they were aliens who belonged to a different social compact, and that they were as alien to us as, say, the people of Sri Lanka are to the American people of the 21st century. I'm not sure we want that original intent. They intended a racist, apartheidist, sexist nation in which Indians were conquered for the purposes of white prosperity. That's not an original intent that anyone wants to get back at. And so these are really complex interpretive issues.
Let's go to another one here, which is unreasonable searches and seizures.
Another excellent case. What's unreasonable? That's what everything is going to depend upon. The Founding Fathers didn't say, there shall be no, this is from the Bill of Rights, there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures, see list. They didn't specify what unreasonable was. Well, it turns out that in a time of great peace and prosperity, unreasonable can be pretty severely interpreted. In other words, if there's nothing much at stake, then we can bend over backwards to avoid unreasonable searches. But in a time of international crisis, what is unreasonable shifts. And there may be a majority of the American people and the legislature, and there may even be a majority of the courts that think, kind of random profiling at the borders is not so unreasonable, given the fact that the World Trade Center came crashing down. Maybe that's not unreasonable. And so people have to interpret that, and there's no simple way to do it. That means we have to accept the fact that imperfect human beings are going to sit in judgment on these cases. We as a people can help influence this by our own reading and our own insistence on certain constitutional principles. But because the Founding Fathers produced so vague a phrase, unreasonable searches and seizures, they made inevitable what we like to call judicial activism.
Here's another discussion you can have about original intent. Did the founders really believe that the black person was only 3/5 of a human being? What were the political factors that led to this controversial clause? Let's talk about high crimes and misdemeanors.
That's a perfect example of how the Founding Fathers didn't tell us what they really had in mind, and how much we have to read into how little they actually deliberated. In other words, we could spend 20 years talking about high crimes and misdemeanors, and they just passed it through on an afternoon because they were trying to get on to something else. Well, there's an actual moment that this occurred at the Constitutional Convention. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and his fellow Virginian George Mason had a very brief exchange about this. And that's the whole original intent. Madison wanted high crimes and misdemeanors, felonious acts, bribery, the language that we now have in the Constitution of the United States. But George Mason wanted to add the phrase maladministration. In other words, you didn't have to commit an indictable crime, you just had to be a bad president. And if you were a sufficiently bad president or Supreme Court justice, if you were having maladministration, that would be grounds to remove you if you could get the Senate to convict. Madison said, I don't know. And so then it passed away, and we were stuck with this very restrictive bribery, high crimes, treason, misdemeanors clause that we still have on the two occasions in the presidency when there has been an impeachment by the House of Representatives. The Senate in both cases has decided, no, there's no maladministration clause. We can't convict because this president didn't really do felonious acts. With the Supreme Court, there's never been a successful impeachment of a Supreme Court justice. The only one that really occurred at all was in 1805, Samuel Chase, who was an enemy of Jefferson's, and Chase should have been removed for maladministration and for bullying and partisanship and all sorts of other awful things. But the Senate said, he didn't commit any crimes. I guess we have to keep him. Think of what pivots on this tiny little discussion that occurred between two Virginia gentlemen 221 years ago.
But it did occur in the judiciary. We've seen impeachments go through there.
We've had a few impeachments. And interestingly enough, the one that actually occurred during Jefferson's time was a man named John Pickering of New Hampshire. He was drunk and maybe actually insane. And his family asked the government to remove him from his post. And so he was impeached and convicted, but he hadn't committed any crimes or misdemeanors. It was a mercy impeachment. But there they stretched the meaning of it to do something that had to be done. So once again, interpretation is everything. My point is, these phrases that we make so much of may have meant much less to the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers didn't always agree anyway. And even if we can sort of in some way ascertain what they had in mind, we still have to stretch this thing to make it work.
Let me give another example here. A father sues the school district in Sacramento, claiming that the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance establishes religion, violating the First Amendment. Does it?
The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said it did. The Ninth Circuit said the phrase "under God" contributes to, quote, an establishment of religion, because the point that they're arguing, and I happen to think that it's a constitutionally sound point, is that the Constitution of the United States requires our government to be absolutely neutral on questions of religion, including the idea that there may not be a God. And so by including the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, there is, in a sense, an establishment, an endorsement of the idea that we live in a God-activated universe. It may be true. It almost certainly is true. But government, according to the Founding Fathers, or at least according to the court's interpretation of the Founding Fathers, is not in a position to make that pronouncement. Government can deliver the mail, it can settle the dispute between Utah and Colorado, but government cannot enter this private zone of your conscience and my conscience. Lots of people disagree with that decision. Lots of people think, hey, we are a Christian nation and there is a God, and what's so wrong about having a Pledge of Allegiance that says that? But the founding, we'll talk about this in another context, but the Founding Fathers were strong in their insistence that the government was going to be neutral on religious questions. And let me remind you that the word God never appears in the Constitution of the United States, not once, not even in the preamble.
Let's go to another case. This gun case is currently under review in the U.S. Supreme Court. Central question is whether the Second Amendment is an individual or a collective right. Did the Founding Fathers intend collective rights?
Well, that's a hard question. In my constitutional interpretation, remember, this is also a political statement. I think the Founding Fathers were intending a collective right because they were trying to promote a militia, a people's army, rather than a permanent standing army. However, we as a nation have chosen to interpret the Second Amendment as providing a broad grant of individual right to you and to me to own guns within certain limits. So what does it mean? They didn't debate it very long in the first Congress of the United States. The Second Amendment kind of flew through without debate. We don't know what they meant. We have to decide what they meant. And we can do one of two things. We can try to say, the Founding Fathers intended this, therefore we'll live by it. But what if that ruins us? What if that, you've seen the mayhem that uncontrolled ownership of guns produces in the United States. We could say, we don't care what they meant. We're going to choose to read it in a way that works. That's a legitimate constitutional interpretive theory. Or we could say, we've got to amend this thing because we have to adhere by that agreed upon code until such time as we amend the Constitution. There are a range of different valid interpretive styles, and no one is the preferred one, and I think we have to calm down a little and realize that we have to trust a good deal that the men and women who get on the court work in earnest, they do their homework, they want to do the right thing for the American people. They're not just there to twist it into some direction that they happen to find enchanting.
Let's go to another phrase that I'd like you to define for us, which is the necessary and proper clause.
That clause is maybe the most contested clause in the Constitution. It says, in the Constitution, it says that the Congress will do such and such and such and such. It enumerates these powers, and then it says, and everything necessary and proper. That is the elastic clause. So the first great moment for this was in 1791 when Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, decided we needed a national bank of the United States. He didn't think he could fulfill his fiscal program without a national bank. So George Washington asked his cabinet ministers to decide whether a national bank was constitutional. Jefferson wrote a famous memo saying, no, it's not constitutional, it's not necessary. It's desirable maybe, but it's not necessary, and we can't just open the Constitution to do things that are desirable or interesting or convenient. They have to be absolutely necessary. And Hamilton said, no, if you do that, you can't be a nation. It doesn't mean absolutely necessary, it means something like useful. Well, depending on how you read the word necessary and proper will determine your constitutional theory. In the famous case McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, Chief Justice Marshall said the necessary clause is going to be read as useful. And since then, the doors have swung open. And whenever government wants to do something, it says the necessary and proper clause enables us to do it, and they also go to something called the general welfare clause from the preamble and say, well, as long as we're doing it for the general welfare, a CIA for the general welfare, a National Endowment for the Arts for the general welfare, National Cucumber Day for the general welfare. If you see what's the problem here, Sam, is that the Constitution has these phrases that enable a broad constructionist to endorse anything. Those phrases have to be extremely narrowly interpreted to keep the lid on government. And Jefferson believed that we must keep the lid on government, and Hamilton and John Marshall thought, no, that condemns you to be a pathetic little third-rate country. If you want to be a great country, you have to have some trapdoors that can be opened to enable things.
And allowing this great ideological debate.
And it will go on forever. You know, cruel and unusual punishment, general welfare, necessary and proper, equal protection, separation of church and state. These debates will go on as long as there are free people in the world who honestly disagree about the nature of their government.